federal veto is the idea that the national government should have the ability to override duly enacted state statutes if they are seen to undermine the national government. Madison, a nationalist, a big fan of the idea that the national government should not allow a single state or even a small coalition of states enact legislation that will undermine the interest of the nation. That doesn't become part of the Constitution. What does is what I think is the principle behind this national veto, which is what we call federalism. The notion that this national government is sovereign over certain things, Article 1, Section 8. The states retain their sovereignty on all other things not delegated to the national government. It's that kind of compromise. By the way, federalism, as understood by that, is one of the novel inventions of the Constitution. It's never seen anywhere before.
Madison's proposal that the national legislature could veto state laws was designed specifically, I think, in reaction to some of the more extreme measures that were being passed in the 1780s. The state legislatures were doing all sorts of things, from printing up a bunch of paper money to actually passing laws that were interfering with mortgages and other contracts that Madison thought were simply unjust. And based upon his experience of these crazy, rabble-rousing state legislatures, Madison felt that the national government had to have a specific vehicle, this veto or this negative, that was going to keep them in check.
James Madison thought the state legislatures were terribly irresponsible bodies. They were enacting laws he thought were unfortunate, sometimes hateful. They often represented what you might refer to in a casual way as the rabble, and he didn't think they did a very good job, and he saw no control on them exercised by the state. So he wanted Congress to have the ability to veto state laws, and he presented that idea at the Constitutional Convention no fewer than 5 times. And you can hear the other delegates become more and more exasperated with him in the notes that we have of the convention. By the 5th time he presents it, and it's lost every time, he's really quite apologetic, and he sort of says, well, I know there's concerns about this, but really I think this is terribly important. It was rejected again. The other delegates thought it was just a stupid idea that Congress would spend all of its time reviewing state laws and none of its time then taking care of the national business, which is what it should be doing.
This wasn't for Madison simply a nationalistic move, in my opinion. It was more the idea that the majority formed at a larger, in the extended republic, among the 13 states, would represent more the refined views of the American citizenry and act as a check on state majorities, especially majority factions. Remember, this is not a positive power at the national level. This is only a veto, a negative power, to stop unconstitutional legislation or legislation that's contrary to the common good.
In the immortal words of Mick Jagger, you can't always get what you want. Madison learned that about 200 years earlier. Now, if he had actually gotten this national veto, what would that have done? It would have gone far down the road to destroying state sovereignty. It would have specifically given the national government a mandate to interfere in state affairs. Now, the way Madison proposed it, it was supposed to be when the state governments did something that negatively affected the other states or the national government. But once you give the national legislature the power to go in and change state laws, that's the end of state laws. It would have been, in some sense, the end of the states.
Well, I think Madison's call for a federal veto says a few things. One, it says we really have to put the defects of the Articles and the defects of state sovereignty or associated with state sovereignty behind us. I think his national veto proposal says we need to be able to have in place a national government that can protect itself against encroachments by the states. I think it says something about Madison being more than a little skeptical about the ability of the states to get this right and to go along with a national government.
To deal with the problem of the relation between state and federal governments, the convention adopted some restrictions on state governments, such as they cannot adopt legislation that impairs the right of contract. They also gave certain powers specifically to the federal government to ensure that that those powers would be exercised by the national government.
In some ways, when we think about the idea of federalism, it's somewhat like teenagers in a house with grown-ups. Grown-ups have an area of their responsibility. Teenagers have their own area of their responsibility as well. And as long as we have rules about who's responsible for what, tends to be okay. Now recognize, of course, you're always going to have some disagreement about how big the teenager's sphere is and how big the parent's sphere is. That's where we have some fun, and 225 odd years later, we're still thinking about those realms. When we think of the things that states aren't allowed to do under the new Constitution, they're the kinds of things that you don't want states to do on their own. For example, you don't want one state to be able to stop another state from engaging in reasonable commerce. You want to make sure that states are working together and not working against one another. You want to make sure that states don't declare war on their own. You want states to be a part of a country as opposed to acting like their own personal country. That's what it is that we get under the Constitution. We continue to grapple with the relationship between states and the federal government every day when states decide that they want to follow their own policy preferences as opposed to federal government's policy preferences. The Affordable Care Act, what some folks may call Obamacare, is one of those situations where there's grappling involved. States would prefer to, at least many states would prefer to deal with health insurance, medical issues on their own as opposed to doing it through a federal system. So oftentimes you have states that say, we'd rather run our own system in our own way, whereas the federal government says, no, this is a federal issue, and as a consequence, we think we ought to run it.
The states still retain a lot of authority. I think there's this marvelous passage, and I believe it's Madison, who talks in the Federalist Papers about the national government concerns itself with issues that are few and well-defined. All the other business, the day-to-day business of the people, will take place in the states. The daily interactions, the daily intercourse, the daily commerce, the things that matter most to us as individuals, they won't be taking place in some faraway national capital. Don't worry, they'll be taking place in the states. Well, we may look back at that quote now with a bit of irony, some of us, dramatic irony.
Since the Constitution's ratification, states have gotten, let's say, less and less authority over various areas. It's not so much that the federal government is creeping into areas where it shouldn't be, as much as it is that national issues have become more numerous. In some ways, we've tied the states together so much that almost any issue can appear to be a national issue. Of course, as we move through wars, as we move through terrorism, as we move through situations where many states are affected at once, we recognize just how interrelated we are. The more interrelated we are, the more national problems become, and the more national solutions make sense. And not surprisingly, as a consequence, the federal government has become that much more powerful.